The moon hung bloated and pale over the mangrove swamps, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. In that ethereal light, the water looked almost peaceful, until you noticed the ripples moving against the current, the V-shaped wakes of things that shouldn't be that large, that patient, that hungry. Lieutenant James Hartley had seen death before, at El Alamein, at Anzio, in a dozen god-forsaken patches of earth where men killed each other over lines drawn on maps by people who'd never heard a bullet scream past their heads. But he'd never seen death like this. The British forces had pushed inland from the beaches, driving Japanese forces deeper into the island's interior. It should have been a straightforward mop-up operation. Pursue, engage, neutralize. Standard procedure. But someone had forgotten to tell the swamp. Or maybe the swamp had been waiting for this moment all along. Hartley crouched at the water's edge, his boots sinking into mud that sucked at them like a living thing. His squad, Morrison, Davies, Tanaka, fanned out beside him, their faces pale in the moonlight. They'd been tracking the Japanese retreat for 3 days, following a trail of abandoned equipment and increasingly desperate signs of flight. But it was the screams that told the real story. They started after sunset, when the swamp came alive. High, terrified shrieks that cut through the darkness like razors. Sometimes they ended abruptly, mid-cry, as if someone had thrown a switch. Sometimes they went on, rising in pitch until they became something barely human, something primal and desperate and utterly, completely doomed. And beneath it all, the splashing, the thrashing, the terrible wet sounds of jaws closing over flesh. "Sir," Morrison whispered, his voice tight, "what the hell is out there?" Hartley didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the water ahead, where something massive had just broken the surface, a ridged back, armored and ancient, at least 15 feet long. It moved with the unhurried confidence of a predator that had never known fear, that had been perfecting the art of killing since before humans learned to walk upright. Then he saw the others, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their eyes reflecting the moonlight in pairs, watching, waiting, hunting. Saltwater crocodiles, the largest reptilian predators on Earth, and the Japanese soldiers had fled right into their feeding grounds. "Nature's mistake," Hartley said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Prehistoric killing machines that should have died with the dinosaurs, but they didn't. They just kept evolving, kept perfecting, kept surviving." "Sir, we need to—" Another scream split the night, this one so close Hartley could hear the water churning, hear the desperate gasps for air between cries, hear the moment when the voice gave out and the thrashing stopped. For 3 years, Hartley had wanted this, had dreamed of it, the Japanese suffering as his brother Tommy had suffered, dying slowly, terrified, far from home. He'd volunteered for this mission specifically to watch them die, to count each scream as justice served. But standing here now, listening to men being torn apart by creatures that cared nothing of nationality or cause or the hatreds that drove humans to war, Hartley felt something crack inside him, something he'd thought was long dead, buried with Tommy at some mass grave in Burma. His humanity, his conscience, his soul. "We're going in," he said, surprising himself as much as his men. "Sir," Davy stared at him. "Into that?" Hartley looked at his squad, young men who'd followed him this far on faith and duty. Morrison, who'd questioned his obsession with revenge. Davies, who still believed in rules and protocol. Tanaka, who understood better than any of them what it meant to be judged by your face rather than your character. "Into that," Hartley confirmed. "Because somewhere out there is a medic singing to dying men. Because somewhere in those trees are soldiers who are somebody's brothers, somebody's sons. Because—" He trailed off, unable to finish, unable to admit that what he'd really discovered in this hellish swamp wasn't the enemy he'd been hunting, but the monster he'd been becoming.
The water rippled. The eyes multiplied.
And the Battle of Ramree Island, the engagement that would become one of World War II's most horrifying and debated chapters, was about to teach Lieutenant Hartley a lesson that no military training could prepare him for. Sometimes the only way to find your humanity is to walk through hell beside your enemy. Sometimes mercy costs more than revenge. And sometimes the monsters we fear most aren't the ones in the water. They're the ones staring back at us in the mirror. Lieutenant James Hartley's hand shot up before Colonel Morrison finished speaking. "I'll take the reconnaissance mission, sir." The briefing room fell silent. 20 officers stared at him, some with pity, others with disgust. They all knew why he'd volunteered. They'd all heard him muttering in his sleep, his brother's name like a curse on his lips. "Hartley," the colonel said carefully, "this isn't a revenge tour. We need clear heads in those swamps." "My head's perfectly clear, sir." Hartley's jaw tightened. "I know the terrain, I know the enemy, and I know what needs to be done." What he didn't say, "I know what they took from me." The memory struck him like shrapnel. That telegram 3 years ago, the words blurring through his tears. "Regret to inform you, Private Thomas Hartley, killed in action at Dunkirk, died bravely in service of king and country." Died bravely. The words were ash in his mouth. Tommy had been 22, barely old enough to shave, writing letters home about the French countryside and the girl he'd left in Dover. Then the Japanese entered the war, and suddenly Tommy's death had faces, enemy faces, that Hartley saw every time he closed his eyes. The Japanese forces are retreating into the Ramree mangrove swamps. Over 1,000 enemy combatants. Your mission is to track their movements, relay positions, and engage only when necessary. The swamps are treacherous, thick mud, limited visibility, and, he hesitated, local reports mention saltwater crocodiles in the area. "I've handled worse, sir." "Have you?" Morrison's voice dropped. "Because the men say you've been handling things poorly. They say you're isolated." Reckless, looking for a bullet with a Japanese name on it. Hartley's hands clenched beneath the table. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Private Morrison, the colonel's nephew, assigned to Hartley's unit, wouldn't meet his eyes. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted. My brother died because of them. Every day I don't fight back is a day I dishonor his memory." Hartley's voice was ice. "So yes, I volunteer. And yes, I'll pursue them into whatever hell they're running to, because that's where they belong." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. You'll leave at dawn. Take your squad, and Hartley?" "Sir?" "Don't lose yourself in that swamp. Men who go in looking for death usually find it." Hartley stood, saluted sharply, and turned for the door. He didn't tell the colonel that he'd already lost himself, that the man who'd laughed with Tommy over Sunday dinners, who taught him to skip stones and tie a proper knot, had died at Dunkirk too. What walked out of that briefing room was something else entirely, something hollow and hungry, fueled by hatred and the need to make someone pay. The swamps of Ramree Island were waiting, and so were the Japanese. The heat hit them first, a suffocating wall that turned the air to soup. Hartley's boots sank into black mud with each step, the suction making obscene sounds as he pulled them free. Around him, the mangrove forest closed in like a living thing, twisted roots erupting from the water in gnarled tangles that blocked sight lines and snagged equipment. The canopy overhead was so thick The daylight barely penetrated, casting everything in a greenish twilight. Christ, it's like breathing through a wet blanket, Private Morrison muttered, swatting at mosquitoes that swarmed in dark clouds. Hartley ignored him. His eyes scanned the murky water, searching for signs of passage. There, a broken branch, fresh, boot prints in the mud, already filling with brackish water. The Japanese had come this way, and recently. "They're panicking," Corporal Davies said, pointing to an abandoned rifle half submerged in the muck. "Good soldiers don't leave their weapons." More evidence appeared as they pushed deeper, a torn pack spilling rice and ammunition, a helmet floating between roots, medical supplies scattered across a mud bank like discarded prayers. The Japanese weren't retreating, they were fleeing. "Looks like they know what's waiting for them," Morrison said. "We are," Hartley replied coldly. The squad moved in single file, weapons ready, every sense heightened. The swamp pressed against them with physical weight. Mud sucked at their legs, branches grabbed at their uniforms. The humidity made it impossible to tell sweat from condensation, and everything, skin, metal, fabric, grew slick and treacherous. But Hartley felt alive for the first time in years. This was what he'd been waiting for. Every step deeper was a step closer to justice for Tommy. "Sir, look at this." Davies crouched beside a makeshift camp. Cooking fires recently extinguished, bedrolls abandoned mid-pack. They left in a hurry, middle of setting up, then just ran. "How many?" asked Hartley. 50, maybe more? All headed that way." Davies pointed toward the darker heart of the swamp. Hartley nodded, satisfaction settling in his chest like cold stone. They were herding the enemy deeper into this nightmare, exactly as planned. The afternoon wore on, the oppressive heat never breaking. They found more signs, blood on the roots, drag marks in the mud, pieces of uniform torn by something sharp. The mood shifted from confident to uncertain. Then the sun began to set. The swamp transformed. Shadows lengthened and merged, turning the water black as oil. Strange sounds emerged from the darkness, splashes that were too large, movement through water that was too deliberate. Something grunted in the distance, a sound more reptilian than human. "What the hell was that?" Morrison's voice whispered, his rifle suddenly tight against his shoulder. Hartley held up a fist, signaling halt. His squad froze, breath held, listening. Another splash, closer this time. Then, from somewhere deep in the darkness ahead, a scream split the air, high, terrified, abruptly cut short. It was followed by thrashing, desperate and brief, then silence, more terrible than any sound. "Sir, that was human," Davies' voice shook. "Japanese," Hartley said, but even he couldn't keep the unease from his voice. The swamp was waking up, and something in those black waters was hungry. The screams multiplied as darkness swallowed the swamp whole. Hartley's unit crouched in the shadows, weapons raised, trying to pinpoint the source. But sound in the mangroves was deceptive. It echoed off water, bounced between roots, came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We need to investigate," Hartley said, his voice cutting through his men's fear. "Sir, with respect, we need to stay put until—" Another scream, closer now, then splashing, thrashing, a gurgling sound that made Hartley's skin crawl despite himself. "Move out. Stay tight." They advanced through knee-deep water, their torches cutting feeble tunnels through the darkness. The beams caught twisted mangrove roots that looked like skeletal fingers, their own ripples spreading across black glass. Every few steps, something brushed against their legs. Debris, they told themselves. Just debris. Morrison's torch found it first. A Japanese uniform, torn to shreds, floating in a pool of blood that looked black in the dim light. Then another, a boot with the foot still in it.
The water churned red around a cluster of roots, and the metallic stench of blood mixed with rot and swamp gas. "Jesus Christ," Davies whispered. Hartley's beam traced drag marks in the mud, deep grooves as wide as his thigh, leading from the shore into deeper water. Something massive had been here. Multiple somethings. "Sir, over here!" They found him on a mud bank. What was left of him? A Japanese soldier, young, impossibly young, clutching his rifle with one hand, while the other pressed uselessly against his torn abdomen. His legs were gone below the knee, the stumps still bleeding sluggishly. His eyes rolled toward them, wide with shock and agony. "Help, please." The words came in broken English, barely audible. Morrison started forward, but Hartley grabbed his arm. "He's already dead. Look at the blood loss." They watched, frozen, as the soldier's breathing grew shallow. He tried to speak again, but only blood came out. His fingers scrabbled at the mud, searching for something, a weapon, salvation, anything. Then his eyes fixed on something behind them, and pure terror transformed his face. Hartley spun, torch beams sweeping across the water.
Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing yellow-green in the darkness, reflecting the torchlight like coins at the bottom of a well. They floated just above the waterline, perfectly still, watching. "Back away," Hartley breathed, slowly. The soldier made one final gurgling sound. Then something erupted from the water with terrifying speed. A massive shape, all scales and teeth and prehistoric violence. The jaws closed over what remained of the soldier's torso with a crack like breaking timber. The body disappeared beneath the surface in an explosion of blood and foam. The squad scrambled backward, splashing through water that now seemed full of moving shadows. More eyes appeared, more shapes gliding beneath the surface with patient, ancient hunger. They made it to higher ground, gasping, shaking. No one spoke for a long moment. The screams continued in the distance, punctuated now by sounds they could identify. Snapping jaws, thrashing water, bones breaking. Morrison finally broke the silence, his voice hollow. "Sir, there must be hundreds of them out there, maybe thousands." He looked at Hartley, and something dark flickered in his eyes. The Japanese walked right into a meat grinder. Maybe we should just let nature do our job for us. The other men nodded slowly, grateful someone had said it. Hartley stared into the darkness, listening to the screams of dying men. He'd wanted revenge. He'd wanted the Japanese to suffer as Tommy had suffered. He'd gotten his wish. So why did his hands shake? Why did the young soldier's face, so terrified, so human, refuse to leave his mind? "We camp here tonight," Hartley said quietly. "Post double watch. Nothing comes near us." But as another scream echoed through the swamp, Hartley knew sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. If you're feeling sick right now, good. You should be. Because what Hartley just witnessed, that young soldier calling for help in broken English, dying alone in the mud while monsters circled, that's the face of war stripped of all its glory. And here's the thing. Hartley wanted this. He volunteered for this. He came here to watch his enemies suffer. So before we continue, I need you to understand something. If this story is making you uncomfortable, if you're questioning whether revenge is ever justified, if you're wondering how far hatred can push a good man, then smash that like button. Because that discomfort, that's your humanity talking. That's the part of you that knows there's something terribly wrong when we celebrate suffering,
even when it's inflicted on our enemies. Subscribe if you want more stories that challenge you, that force you to confront the darkness we're all capable of, because Lieutenant Hartley is about to learn the hardest lesson of his life, and you need to see how this ends.
Dawn brought no relief, only harsh light that revealed what darkness had hidden. "We're moving forward," Hartley announced, checking his ammunition. His men stared at him in disbelief. Davies spoke first. "Sir, we've accomplished the reconnaissance. We know where they are. We should report back." "We push deeper. That's an order." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The squad fell into formation, following Hartley into the heart of the massacre. The evidence was everywhere. A body wedged 15 feet up in a mangrove tree, arms still locked around the trunk in a death grip that hadn't saved him. Hartley's torch beam found teeth marks on the bark below. The crocodiles had climbed or waited. Either way, the man had died slowly, bleeding out in the branches while monsters circled beneath. "They tried to escape," Davies whispered, staring up at the corpse. "They failed," Hartley said flatly, moving on. More bodies, a mud bank where boot prints circled endlessly, telling the story of men who'd made their stand back to back as the water rose around them. Spent shell casings glinted in the mud. They'd fired everything they had. It hadn't been enough. What remained was scattered across the bank in pieces, picked clean by the swamp's scavengers. Morrison stopped walking. "Sir, this is wrong." "Keep moving, Private." "No," Morrison's voice was steel. "Look around you. This isn't a battlefield. It's a slaughterhouse." Hartley turned slowly. The rage that had kept him warm for 3 years flickered in his eyes. And we're supposed to be soldiers, not vultures picking through corpses." Morrison gestured at the horror surrounding them. "This isn't war anymore, sir. This is just watching men die." "Good." The word hung in the humid air like poison. The squad exchanged glances, shocked by the venom in their lieutenant's voice. "Good." Morrison stepped closer, his fear replaced by anger. "My uncle was right about you. You're not here to fight. You're here to watch them suffer." "They killed my brother." "No, sir. The war killed your brother, just like it's killing all of us, piece by piece." Morrison's hand swept across the swamp. "These men, they're somebody's brothers too, somebody's sons, and they're dying in the worst way possible while we stand here and watch." Hartley's hand moved to his sidearm. For a moment, the whole squad held its breath. Then another scream split the air, followed by violent splashing maybe 100 yards ahead, the sound of jaws shutting shut. Silence. "That's one less," Hartley said quietly. "One less who might have been at Dunkirk. One less who might have killed Tommy." He met Morrison's eyes. "So yes, good. I hope they all die screaming. I hope they know terror before the end, because that's justice." "That's not justice," Morrison said, his voice breaking. "That's just revenge, and it's turning you into something worse than what you're fighting." Hartley turned away. "We continue the pursuit. That's final." They moved deeper into the swamp, following the trail of carnage. But the unit's cohesion was fracturing. Men who'd followed Hartley into hell were starting to question whether he'd lead them back out, or if he even wanted to. Above them, more bodies hung in the trees like grotesque ornaments. Below, the water rippled with patient, hungry movement. And somewhere ahead, the dying continued. Hartley told himself the tightness in his chest was satisfaction. He told himself the faces of the dead soldiers didn't look like Tommy's. He told himself these were lies and pushed forward anyway. They found the abandoned camp mid-morning, half submerged in rising water. The Japanese had left in panic, cooking pots still hanging over cold fires, personal items scattered like confetti. Hartley's squad spread out, searching for intelligence, anything useful. But Hartley's attention fixed on a body slumped against a tree root, an officer by the insignia. The man's face was gray, his uniform torn. A crocodile had taken his legs, but he'd crawled here to die on dry land. His hand still clutched a small leather-bound book against his chest. Hartley pried it free, a diary, pages water-stained but readable. Japanese characters covered every page in tight, careful script. "Davies, get the interpreter over here." Private Tanaka, a Nisei soldier who'd proven his loyalty 100 times over, approached reluctantly. He'd been quiet since they'd entered the swamp, his face tight with something Hartley couldn't read. "Translate," Hartley ordered, handing him the diary. Tanaka opened it, began reading. His voice was flat, professional. "January 15th, we received orders to hold the line at..." He flipped pages. "February 2nd, the British advance. We're outnumbered. Command says retreat to the interior." More pages. "February 10th, the swamps. God help us. The screams at night. Watanabe-san taken last night. We found only his helmet. The water is alive with them." "Skip to older entries," Hartley said, "before Ramree." Tanaka turned pages backwards, his expression growing troubled. "Sir, are you sure?" "Read." "November 18th, Burma." Tanaka's voice wavered. "Today we encountered a wounded British soldier in the village ruins. He was badly injured, maybe dying. My men wanted to finish it, but I couldn't. He looked so young, calling for his mother in English. I gave him water, made him comfortable. He showed me a ring, silver, with a family crest, 2 birds intertwined. He said his brother gave it to him. His name was Thomas. He died quietly holding that ring. I prayed for him. I hope someone prays for me." The swamp seemed to hold its breath. Hartley's world tilted. The ring, 2 birds intertwined, a family heirloom passed down through generations. He'd given it to Tommy the day before he shipped out. "Keep it safe. Bring it home." "Sir?" Tanaka's voice came from very far away. Hartley's hand moved mechanically to his pocket, where he kept Tommy's last letter, the one that said Dunkirk, the one that was wrong. Tommy hadn't died at Dunkirk. He died in Burma, in some forgotten village, holding Hartley's ring, while an enemy soldier, this dead man's words, showed him mercy. "Continue," Hartley whispered. "November 19th, I can't stop thinking about the British soldier, Thomas. We're supposed to hate them, fight them, kill them, but all I saw was a boy far from home. My orders were clear. My duty was clear, but when I looked at him, I saw my own brother. I chose mercy. I hope I'm not damned for it." The diary shook in Hartley's hands. 3 years, 3 years of hatred built on a foundation of lies. He blamed the Japanese for Dunkirk, for something they hadn't even done, and the man who'd actually been there when Tommy died, he'd shown compassion. He'd prayed for an enemy soldier in his final moments. "Sir," Morrison's voice cut through the fog, "are you all right?" Hartley looked at the dead officer, really looked at him. Young, maybe 30, his face peaceful despite the horror of his death. In his other hand, Hartley noticed, was a photograph, a family, wife, 2 children, an elderly couple. They were smiling. The hatred that had kept Hartley warm for 3 years cracked like ice over deep water. Beneath it was something vast and terrifying. Grief, raw and unprocessed, and guilt. Because he'd wanted this man to suffer,
He'd watched others like him die screaming, and all along, this man had shown Tommy more humanity in death than Hartley had shown anyone since. "Pack up the diary," Hartley said quietly. "It's evidence." But what it was evidence of, he could no longer say. Justice, revenge, or just the complicated, tragic truth that war made monsters of everyone, and mercy was the rarest casualty of all. The swamp offered no answers, only more screams in the distance.
Stop. Just stop for a second. Hartley just spent 3 years hating the wrong people for the wrong reasons. 3 years building his entire identity around revenge for something that never happened the way he thought it did. And the man who was actually there when his brother died, he showed Tommy mercy, compassion, humanity. If you've ever held on to anger, if you've ever let hatred consume you, if you've ever built your whole world around making someone pay and then discovered you were wrong, hit that like button. Because that moment when everything you believed shatters, that's what Hartley is feeling right now. And there's no going back from this. Subscribe, because we're about to see what a man does when the foundation of his rage crumbles beneath him. Does he find a new reason to hate, or does he finally let himself grieve? The answer is in that swamp, waiting. Let's find it together. Day 3 brought them face to face with the living. Hartley's unit spotted them from 50 yards out. 8 Japanese soldiers clustered on a mud bank barely 10 feet across, surrounded by dark water that rippled with patient movement. They weren't fighting, they weren't fleeing, they were trapped. "Contact," Davies whispered, raising his rifle. "Hold fire," Hartley said automatically, his mind still churning with the diary's revelations. Through his binoculars, he could see their faces, exhausted, terrified, human. One soldier kept looking at the water, his rifle shaking. Another was praying, hands clasped, lips moving silently. A third, young, wearing a medic's armband, was wrapping a comrade's leg wound with strips torn from his own uniform. "Sir, they're sitting ducks. We could take them prisoner. Get intelligence." Hartley lowered the binoculars. Prisoner. Yesterday, he would have let them die. Today he didn't know what he wanted anymore. One of the Japanese soldiers spotted them. Instead of reaching for weapons, he shouted across the water, desperate, pleading. Tanaka translated quietly. "He's asking for bullets, not surrender, not mercy, just ammunition to fight the crocodiles." The absurdity of it struck Hartley like a blow. Men so terrified of what lurked in the water that they'd rather die fighting British soldiers than face the reptiles unarmed. "We should help them," Tanaka said softly. "Sir, we should secure them as prisoners. That's protocol." "Protocol?" Morrison's voice was sharp. "Look at them. They're already dead. We'd just be—" The water exploded. Hartley just stood there, frozen, paralyzed by the weight of a choice he couldn't make. And 7 men died because of it. If you've ever frozen when you needed to act, if you've ever hesitated when someone needed you, if you've ever looked back at a moment and thought, "I could have done something," this is for you. Hit that like button, because Hartley's failure is the most human thing we've seen yet. He's not a hero, he's not a villain. He's just a man drowning in moral complexity, and it's costing lives. Subscribe if you need to see whether he finds redemption or just more regret. Because there's one more chance coming, one more moment when Hartley will have to choose, and this time, hesitation isn't an option. The medic is still out there, the crocodiles are still hunting, and Lieutenant Hartley is running out of time to save his soul. A massive crocodile launched itself onto the mud bank with horrifying speed, jaws closing around a soldier's torso before anyone could react. His scream was cut short as he was dragged backward into the water.
His comrades opened fire, bullets churning the surface, but the crocodiles were already disappeared with their prey. Then another attacked, and another. "Open fire!" Morrison shouted, not waiting for orders. The British squad unleashed a volley, trying to drive back the reptiles, but the crocodiles were too many, too fast, too ancient in their hunger. One soldier was pulled under mid-scream. Another's rifle clicked empty just as jaws clamped onto his leg, dragging him towards the water's edge. The medic grabbed his arm, trying to hold him, but the crocodile's strength was overwhelming. "We need to get closer," Davies yelled. Hartley stood frozen, watching the massacre unfold. The medic's face, young, terrified, determined, overlapped with the diary's words, "I saw my own brother." These weren't faceless enemies. They were someone's brothers, sons, friends, and he was watching them die because he couldn't decide if they deserved saving. Morrison's rifle barked beside him, taking down a crocodile that had lunged for the medic. The young man looked toward them, eyes wide with confusion and desperate hope. "Hartley!" Morrison grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. "Give the order!" But Hartley's voice wouldn't come. 3 years of hatred warred with one day's revelation. The need for revenge fought against the memory of an enemy officer praying over Tommy's body. By the time he found his voice, it was too late. The mud bank was empty, except for blood and one figure. The medic, somehow still alive, scrambling through the shallows towards a cluster of roots. A crocodile surfaced behind him, massive and inevitable. Morrison fired without orders, the bullet striking scales, buying seconds. The medic reached the roots, pulled himself up, and disappeared into the dense mangroves. The water settled. 7 men gone in less than 2 minutes. Hartley's squad stood in shocked silence, weapons still raised, watching ripples spread across bloody water. "We could have saved them," Tanaka said quietly, "if we'd acted sooner." "We tried," Morrison cut him off, but his eyes found Hartley. The accusation was unspoken, but clear. "You hesitated. You let them die." Hartley stared at the empty mud bank, at the water now calm again, as if nothing had happened. Somewhere in the mangroves, the young medic was running for his life. And Hartley still didn't know if he hoped the man would survive. Night fell, like an executioner's hood. Hartley's unit moved through waist-deep water, searching for higher ground. But the swamp had changed. The ripples that followed them weren't from their own movement. The splashes behind them weren't debris settling. They were being watched. "Sir," Davis whispered, his torch beam sweeping across the water. "Something's following us." Hartley saw them then, those yellow-green eyes, multiplying in the darkness, not just watching anymore, tracking. The crocodiles had learned that men in the swamp meant easy prey. They no longer distinguished between uniforms. "Double time!" Hartley ordered, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "Find solid ground, now!" They splashed forward, but the water seemed to grab at them, the mud sucking at their boots like quicksand. Behind them, the ripples grew closer. A massive shape surfaced briefly, 15 feet of scaled muscle and prehistoric hunger before submerging again. "They're hurting us," Morrison said, his voice tight, "just like they did to the Japanese." The realization hit Hartley like cold water. The swamp didn't care about nations or causes or revenge. It only cared about meat. Tanaka screamed. Hartley spun to see jaws clamped around the interpreter's leg, dragging him backward. Morrison and Davies grabbed his arms, a desperate tug of war with a creature that had survived unchanged for millions of years. Tanaka's screams turned ragged, his teeth ground through muscle. "Shoot it!" Davies yelled. Hartley fired into the water again and again until the crocodile released its grip and vanished. They hauled Tanaka onto a root cluster, his leg a mangled mess, bone visible through torn flesh. "Bunker!" Morrison pointed, A concrete structure barely visible through the trees, an old Japanese position, half collapsed but still standing. "We can defend it!" They ran, half carrying Tanaka, splashing through water that churned with movement. More shapes surfaced around them. Jaws snapped at Davy's heel, missing by inches. Something massive brushed against Hartley's leg, a reminder of how easily he could join the swamp's dead. The bunker's entrance loomed ahead. They scrambled inside, dragging Tanaka just as a crocodile lunged from the water. Morrison slammed his rifle butt into its snout, buying seconds. They pulled the rusted door closed, wedging it with debris. Darkness, ragged breathing, the sound of water lapping against concrete. "Medical kit," Hartley ordered, his hands shaking. Davies worked on Tanaka's leg, while Morrison and Hartley covered the narrow firing slits. Outside, shapes moved in the water, patient, waiting. The crocodiles weren't leaving. Why would they? The bunker was just another mud bank, and they had all the time in the world. "How long can we last?" Davies asked quietly. "Until dawn," Hartley said, trying to sound confident. "Then we move, if they let us." Hours crawled past. Tanaka drifted in and out of consciousness, his face gray with blood loss. The squad took turns watching the water, listening to the same sounds that had haunted Japanese soldiers for days. Splashing, grunting, the scrape of scales on concrete. "Sir," Morrison said finally, his voice stripped of anger. "I understand now. What we've been watching, this is what they faced, every night, every moment." Hartley nodded slowly, staring through the firing slit at eyes that glowed in the darkness. The Japanese soldiers weren't abstract enemies anymore. They were men who stood exactly where Hartley stood now, terrified and trapped, realizing that all their training and weapons and courage meant nothing against this ancient, indifferent hunger. "The swamp's the enemy," Hartley said quietly. "It always was. We just couldn't see it through our hate." And now, Hartley thought of the diary, of Tommy, of the young medic running through darkness, alone and hunted, of all the men, both British and Japanese, who died screaming in these waters because human beings couldn't stop killing each other long enough to see the real monster. "Now, we survive," Hartley said, "and if we find that medic, we help him." Morrison smiled grimly. "About time, sir." Outside, the crocodiles waited. Inside, for the first time in days, Hartley felt something other than hatred. He felt human again. Now Hartley understands. Now he knows what those Japanese soldiers faced every single night. The terror, the helplessness, the realization that all your training, all your weapons, all your courage means nothing when nature decides you're prey.
If you finally see the enemy as human, if you finally understand that the men you wanted to watch suffer were just scared soldiers far from home, if you finally realize that the swamp never cared about nationality, only meat, then hit that like button, because that's empathy. That's what happens when you're forced to walk in your enemy's shoes. Subscribe, because we're heading toward the moment that will define everything. Hartley has one chance to choose differently. One chance to honor his brother's memory not with revenge, but with the same mercy that was shown to Tommy in his final moments. Will he take it, or will 3 years of hatred win? We're about to find out. Dawn broke over the swamp, revealing what night had hidden. A small mud bank, perhaps 20 feet across, rising from the wire like a grave marker. And on it, the medic. Hartley's unit spotted him through the morning mist. He wasn't alone. 4 wounded Japanese soldiers lay around him, their uniforms soaked with blood and swamp water. One man clutched his stomach, gut shot and dying slowly. Another's leg was twisted at an impossible angle. A third coughed wetly, each breath a struggle. The medic moved between them with careful precision, checking wounds with hands that never stopped shaking. He had no supplies left, no bandages, no morphine, nothing but torn strips of uniform and muddy water. But he worked anyway, speaking softly to each man, his voice carrying across the water. He was singing. "What's he saying?" Hartley whispered to Tanaka, who leaned heavily on Morrison's shoulder. Tanaka listened, his face softening despite the pain. "It's a children's song, about going home, about mothers waiting." His voice cracked. "He's singing them home." The water around the mud bank rippled with dark shapes. Dozens of crocodiles circled with patient, terrible certainty. They'd learned to wait. Wounded prey couldn't run forever. "We could take them prisoner," Davies said quietly. "Pull them off before." "Or we could keep moving," Morrison interrupted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sir, we've barely got enough supplies to get ourselves out. Tanaka needs proper medical attention. If we engage, if we try to extract them, we might not make it out at all," Davies finished. Hartley raised his binoculars, studying the scene. The medic had stopped singing. He'd seen them, a British squad, armed, watching from the trees. Their eyes met across 50 yards of killing water. The medic didn't shout, didn't wave, didn't beg. He simply held Hartley's gaze for a long moment, then turned back to his dying comrades. He adjusted one man's head to ease his breathing, held another's hand, started singing again, softer now, as if the song was just for them. It was the most dignified thing Hartley had ever witnessed. "Jesus," Morrison breathed. "He's not even asking." "He knows we won't help," Davies said bitterly. "Why would we? They're the enemy." "Are they?" Tanaka's voice was barely audible. "Right now, they look like us last night, trapped, scared, human." A crocodile surfaced near the mud bank, its massive head breaking the water's surface. The gut-shot soldiers saw it and began to weep, quietly, hopelessly. The medic moved to block his view, still singing, trying to give his friend dignity in death. Hartley's finger rested on his trigger. One order, that's all it would take. They could provide cover fire, extract the survivors, save lives instead of counting bodies. Or they could leave, preserve their ammunition, their strength, get Tanaka to safety. Let the swamp finish what neither side had started. The diary's words echoed in his mind. "I saw my own brother." Tommy had died with an enemy soldier praying over him, showing mercy when orders sent to kill, choosing humanity when war demanded hatred. "Sir?" Morrison's voice pulled him back. The medic continued singing, his voice growing hoarse. The dying men around him grew quieter, finding peace in the familiar melody. The crocodiles drifted closer, their patience finally waning. Hartley watched the young medic, maybe 20, maybe younger, facing death with quiet courage, refusing to abandon his friends even when rescue stood watching from the trees. And he thought, "This is who I've been hunting. This is who I wanted to watch die." The choice crystallized, sharp and clear as broken glass. Hartley raised his rifle. The medic closed his eyes, still singing. And Hartley made his decision. Hartley's rifle barked, not at the medic, but at the water. The bullet struck a crocodile surging toward the mud bank, the impact making it thrash and veer away. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. The medic, the dying soldiers, Hartley's own squad. "Covering fire!" Hartley roared across the water. "Drive them back!" Morrison reacted first, his rifle joining Hartley's, then Davies, then even wounded Tanaka propping his weapon on a root and firing with grim determination. The water erupted in a storm of bullets and blood, forcing the crocodiles to scatter. "Move!" Hartley shouted across the water. "To the trees, now!" The medic stared at them, comprehension dawning on his exhausted face. He grabbed the nearest wounded man, hauling him upright. Another soldier tried to stand on his broken leg and collapsed. The gut-shot man couldn't move at all. "Leave me," he gasped in Japanese. Tanaka translated without being asked, his voice breaking. He says, "Leave him. He's already dead." The medic shook his head violently, refusing. He slung one man over his shoulder and started dragging another toward the trees,
moving through shallow water while British bullets churned the surface around him.
A massive crocodile, bigger than the others, scarred and ancient, surfaced directly in their path. Hartley's shot ricocheted off its armored skull. It kept coming. Morrison didn't hesitate. He splashed into the water, firing as he moved, drawing the creature's attention. "Go! Get them out! Hartley, fall back!" Morrison screamed. But Morrison was committed, wading deeper, his rifle thundering. The medic and his wounded Japanese soldiers stumbled past him, reaching the root clusters where Davies pulled them to safety. The massive crocodile turned, its cold eyes fixing on Morrison. "Morrison!" Hartley was moving before he could think, splashing through water that suddenly felt thick as concrete. The crocodile struck with horrifying speed. Jaws closed around Morrison's torso with a sound like wood splitting. His scream cut through the gunfire, raw and terrible. The water turned red. Hartley reached him as the crocodile began its death roll. He grabbed Morrison's arm, trying to hold on, but the reptile's strength was impossible. Morrison's eyes found his, clear despite the agony. "Worth it," Morrison gasped. Blood bubbled from his lips. "Tell my uncle, worth it." Then the crocodile dragged him under. Hartley fired into the churning water until his magazine clicked empty. Davies pulled him back before another crocodile could strike. They stumbled to the root cluster, where the medic and the 3 wounded Japanese soldiers huddled, saved but shattered. The water settled. Morrison was gone. Silence descended, only broken by ragged breathing and the distant calls of swamp birds. The medic approached slowly, his face streaked with mud and tears. He looked at Hartley, really looked at him, trying to understand why an enemy had saved his life at the cost of his own friend. His mouth opened, closed. No words in any language could bridge that moment. Finally, he bowed, deep and formal, holding it despite his exhaustion. When he straightened, his eyes shimmered with confused gratitude and profound sorrow. He understood what it had cost. Hartley nodded once, unable to speak. His closest friend was dead. Morrison, who'd questioned his hatred, who'd challenged him, who'd ultimately died protecting the men Hartley had once wanted to watch suffer. And standing there watching the medic tend to his wounded comrades with the same quiet dignity he'd shown on the mudbank, Hartley felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not even peace. Just the heavy, aching weight of choosing right over easy. He'd saved his enemy and lost his friend. The war would continue. The killing wouldn't stop. But in this one moment, in this hellish swamp, he'd chosen humanity. And he didn't regret it. Not even as he watched Morrison's helmet float past, carried away by the current. Not even then. Morrison just died, saving the men Hartley wanted to watch suffer. Hartley chose humanity over hatred, and it cost him his closest friend. The man who challenged him, the man who saw the good in him when Hartley couldn't see it himself. Gone. Dragged under by a crocodile because he chose mercy over survival. If you're crying right now, good, you should be. Because this is what choosing right over easy looks like. This is the price of redemption. It's not pretty, it's not fair, and it hurts like hell. Hit that like button if you understand that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee a happy ending. Subscribe if you believe that even in the darkest moments of human history, even in the most brutal circumstances, choosing humanity matters. Even when it costs everything. Because Morrison's last words were worth it. And Hartley, standing there covered in his friend's blood, watching the medic bow in gratitude, didn't regret it. That's what courage really looks like. Not killing your enemies, but saving them.
anyway. The extraction took 6 hours. By the time they reached British lines, Tanaka had developed a fever, and the Japanese medic, whose name was Kenji, had saved his life twice with improvised tourniquets. At the forward base, while medical officers tended to the wounded, Hartley stood in the intelligence tent reading the decoded Japanese communications they'd intercepted. "It was a deliberate sacrifice," the intelligence officer explained, pointing to the documents. "Their command knew about the crocodiles. They ordered the retreat into the swamps to slow our advance while their main forces evacuated north. A suicide mission dressed up as a tactical withdrawal." Hartley's hands tightened on the papers. The men he'd hunted, the men he'd watched die screaming, they'd been condemned by their own side. Pawns sacrificed in a game they never understood they were playing. "The prisoners?" Hartley asked. "They're being processed. The medic keeps asking for something, won't say what." Hartley found Kenji in the holding area, clutching a waterproof pouch against his chest like a lifeline. When he saw Hartley, he stood quickly, bowing. "Please," Kenji said in broken English, offering the pouch. "Letters. Soldiers. Dying. They write home. I promise. Deliver." Inside were dozens of letters, some blood-stained, some water-damaged, all precious. Hartley's hands shook as he unfolded them one by one, Tanaka translating from his hospital cot. Most were heartbreaking. Final words to mothers, wives, children, apologies for dying so far from home, promises that they'd fought with honor. Then Tanaka's voice caught. "Sir, this one—"
The letter was dated 3 days ago, written in a shaky hand. The soldier described the horror of the swamp, the certainty of death. But mostly, he wrote about guilt, about a British prisoner in Burma, a young man named Thomas with a silver ring, about following orders to execute him, about the nightmares that followed. "I see his face every night. He called for his brother at the end. I gave him water, prayed for him, but it doesn't erase what I did. I ask his family's forgiveness, though I don't deserve it. I ask God's forgiveness, though I expect none. If anyone reads this, please know I died carrying the weight of his death. Perhaps that is justice." Hartley's vision blurred. The soldier who killed Tommy had died in this swamp 2 days ago, suffering the same terror, the same slow horror. The diary's author hadn't killed Tommy, but he'd been haunted by the death all the same, carrying the burden until crocodiles gave him the release guilt never could. "Deliver them," Hartley said quietly, handing the letters back to Kenji. "All of them. Through Red Cross channels. I'll arrange it." Kenji's eyes widened. "You help?" "Someone showed my brother mercy once. Time I returned the favor." 2 weeks later, Hartley stood outside Morrison's family home in Sussex. The colonel, Morrison's uncle, answered the door, his face carved with grief. "I'm sorry," Hartley said, the words inadequate but honest. "He saved lives, enemy lives, and he didn't regret it. He said it was worth it." The colonel nodded slowly. That sounds like him, always seeing the humanity in things. He studied Hartley. "You look different, lighter somehow." "I'm learning to let go." Ramree Island was behind them now, shrinking in the transport ship's wake. But Hartley stood at the rail one final time, looking back at the mangrove coast. He pulled Tommy's ring from his pocket, the one the medic had returned, found on the dead soldier's body. For 3 years he'd clutched it like a weapon. Now it felt like a chain. Hartley kissed the silver once, whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," and let it fall. The ring tumbled end over end, catching sunlight,
then disappeared into the water without a sound. The swamp had taken so much, British, Japanese, friend and enemy alike, but it had given something back too, the understanding that hatred was just another kind of death, and mercy, however costly, was the only way to truly live. The war would continue, men would keep dying, but Hartley had found his way back to the light, and that, finally, was enough. The Battle of Ramree Island remains one of World War II's most debated engagements. Historians argue over casualty numbers. Some claim nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers died in those swamps. Others suggest far fewer. The truth, like so much of war, may never be fully known. What is certain, men died there. British and Japanese alike faced an enemy neither side anticipated. The saltwater crocodiles of Ramree's mangroves killed indiscriminately, their ancient hunger caring nothing for flags or causes or the hatreds that drive humans to war. This story honors all who suffered in that hellish swamp, those who died, those who survived, and those who learned, however painfully, that the real enemy is often not the soldier across the battlefield, but the darkness we carry within ourselves. War makes monsters of men, but it also sometimes reveals what it means to be human. May we remember both lessons. Hartley threw the ring into the water. After 3 years of clutching it like a weapon, using it to fuel his hatred, letting it chain him to the past, he finally let it go. Not in anger, in release. If this story changed you, if you see revenge differently now, if you understand that the real enemy is often the darkness inside us, not the person across the battlefield, then hit that like button and leave a comment telling me, what would you have done in Hartley's position? Would you have pulled the trigger on the medic or the crocodile? Subscribe, because war makes monsters of us all, but it also sometimes reveals what it means to be human, and that's a lesson worth remembering. The Battle of Ramree Island is one of World War II's most debated engagements. Some say nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers died in those swamps. Others suggest far fewer. But here's what we know for certain. Men died there, British and Japanese alike, and some of them, like Lieutenant Hartley, had to decide whether they'd become the monsters their enemies thought they were, or find the courage to be something better. Share this story, because in a world that's still obsessed with revenge, that still celebrates hatred, that still draws lines between us and them, we need more people willing to choose mercy, even when it costs everything, even when it costs a friend, even when it costs a piece of your soul, because that's what it means to be human in a world of monsters. Thank you for watching. If you felt the fear, the tension, and the reality of these true World War II stories, stay with this channel, because there are many more dark survival stories waiting to be told.